Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, bringing you the latest headlines when it comes to this war that we've seen a ceasefire of between United States, Israel, Iran, and Lebanon. Top of the hour, well, a lot has happened this past weekend. Essentially, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson saying that the government of Iran has no plans regarding a new round of talks with the United States after the United States has seized an Iranian flag cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz. This is what has happened over the weekend. And essentially, even though President Trump is saying that the U.S. team led by Vice President J.D. Vance is on their way for a second round of talks with Iran in Pakistan's capital city of Islamabad, essentially Iran is saying they have no plans for talks. So this is massive in terms of what this means for the ceasefire that's been in place since April 7th. And we know that when it comes to Israel and Lebanon, well, that's been on ceasefire since last Thursday. It's supposed to go on for 10 days. Essentially, I'm going to catch you up on the latest that's happened. But meanwhile, Pakistan is still preparing, obviously, because President Trump is saying that the United States is on their way for a second round of talks. So Pakistan has tightened its security in Islamabad before the possible talks because we don't have time right now. Of course, we're going to keep you up to date as this development story, develops over time and we hear from Iran if they are actually not going to show, because as of now, they're saying that they do not plan to go for talks. And what that means for the U.S. delegates is that a way to embarrass them? It will be very embarrassing if Vice President J.D. Vance shows up to Islamabad for talks and there is no Iranian delegation there to talk to him. But Islamabad is going to do what it needs to do, which is have 20,000 security personnel all throughout the city, essentially locking down parts of the city to make sure this, high stakes ceasefire talk to end the war continues between the two parties. Although one is on its way, the other one is not showing up, according to Iran. And since this 10-day ceasefire in southern Lebanon by Israeli forces, essentially, that's due for a second round of talks between Israel and Lebanon, and that's supposed to be held this week in Washington on Thursday. And thousands of Lebanese people have continued to return to their homes to see what remains in their, for where their home was in southern Lebanon. So it's devastating. Although we, did a final recap last Friday, where you saw all the Lebanese people on their way back to, where they called home. So that ceasefire still stands. So now if you're wondering what's going on with Iran, what's going on with the United States, Israel, what does it mean for gas prices? What does it mean for the overall conflict? Well, Iran is now threatening retaliation after calling the U.S. seizure of its cargo ship piracy. So what happened? Do you recall the first round of talks took place in Islamabad? They did not come to terms in agreement of Iran's enrichment of uranium. Iran has had the ability to enrich uranium for civilian purposes before. And that was the agreement, if you recall, with Obama, right? It was at 3%. And then since Trump in his first term, when he tore that up, Iran just started enriching uranium up to 60%. Essentially, that's where things are at. And so when they had this ceasefire talk in Islamabad, the first round, essentially, President Trump came with a hard line saying that it wants Iran to stop enriching uranium at all, like 0%, not even for civilian purposes, for 20 years. And then the conversation about what to do with its already enriched uranium, which you recall last year, the 12-day war that started with Israel and Iran, and the United States joined in, was to essentially destroy the sites where enriched uraniums were. And then Iran turned around and said, no, they already moved it before the attacks, even though President Trump said that they destroyed it. We've even heard Vice President JD Vance talk about it being destroyed, but the question remains, the rest of the enriched uranium, what to do with it. And that's been pretty much the conversation at that first round of talks. And Iran saying that they could agree to 3 to 5 year term of not enriching uranium, essentially taking them till the end of the Trump administration is the 3 year mark, right? So that's where the latest thing is. And since they didn't come to terms in terms of negotiating on that, President Trump decided to, and mind you, Iran was still blocking the Strait of Hormuz because Israel was continuing its occupation and bombing in southern Lebanon. And that was part of the ceasefire agreement on April 7th. Okay, so Israel continues what it's doing in Lebanon, and then the White House says that Israel and Lebanon are not part of the ceasefire agreement. Iran says, yes, they were. They were part of the 10 points you said you would consider, right, for negotiations, which is why, we agreed to the ceasefire April 7th. Okay, so then Iran decided that it's still going to block the Strait of Hormuz until the Israel-Lebanon situation is resolved in terms of a ceasefire as well. But when the talks in Islamabad take place and they don't agree on Iran's enrichment of uranium activity, President Trump decides that now he's going to blockade Iranian ports. At first, we weren't clear about that. It was we're going to blockade also the Strait of Hormuz, but then they clarified it days later, saying that they're going to blockade the ports of Iran, essentially, as think of it this way, preventing Iran from exporting its oil to China and elsewhere, right? So that was taking place. And then when the ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel was announced last Thursday, Iran said, okay, we're going to now open the Strait of Hormuz. It's open, right? Even before they said it was open to civilian vessels. But then since the ceasefire in Israel and Lebanon, they said it's completely open. But the American vessels were still there blockading the Iranian ports. So now what happened this weekend? This weekend, essentially, the American vessels seized the Iranian ship coming back from China to Iran. And this is why Iran is now calling it piracy and now will refuse to have the second round of talks. So this is a massive escalation. And I guess from so both sides are pretty much, appears that they're playing the same strategy, right? In terms of show brute force, in terms of, escalate things and add pressure for negotiation. And that seems to be the case on both sides. And so when President Trump then creates a blockade after Iran had already created a blockade and then continues to do so, now, you're seeing the fallout of it in terms of if there's not a second round of talks, then does that mean the ceasefire is over? Because we know the ceasefire was for 2 weeks. That means that it ends on the 22nd in 2 days. So we're in that 48-hour less time period to see how the ceasefire ends. If it ends without an agreement to end the war, does that mean it picks up and escalates again, which nobody wants? But that is to be seen what happens in this case. And if President Trump has announced that Vice President JD Vance is on his way, does that mean that the Iranian delegation is now forced to show up, or will they not show up as they said they won't, and it would be very embarrassing for President Trump and of course Vice President JD Vance. On Truth Social, there's a few posts that I want to read by the president. So essentially this is President Trump saying Iran decided to fire bullets yesterday in the Strait of Hormuz, a total violation of our ceasefire agreement. Many of them were aimed at the French ship and freight from the United Kingdom. That was a nice was it? My representatives are going to Islamabad, Pakistan. They will be there tomorrow evening for negotiations. Iran recently announced that they were closing the strait, which is strange because our blockade was already closed it. Our blockade has already closed it. They're helping us without knowing, and they're the ones that lose with the closed passage. $500 million a day. The United States loses nothing. In fact, many ships are headed right now to the US, Texas, Louisiana, and Alaska to load up compliments of the IRGC. Always wanted to be the tough guy. We're offering a very fair and reasonable deal, and I hope they take it, because if they don't, the United States is going to knock out every single power plant and every single bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy. They'll come down fast. They'll come down easy, and if they don't take the deal, it will be my honor to do what has to be done, which should have been done to Iran by other presidents for the last 47 years. It's time for the Iran killing machine to end. President Donald J. Trump. There you have it. Essentially, that is the president's statement, essentially going back to bombing bridges, power plants, and that's the latest. And then the other item here that President Trump posted, and this is today, as you can see, saying, Israel never talked me into the war with Iran. The results of October 7th added to my lifelong opinion that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Did. I watch and read the fake news pundits and polls in total disbelief. 90% of what they say are lies and made up of stories, and the polls are rigged, much as the 2020 presidential election was rigged. Just like the results in Venezuela, which the media doesn't like talking about, the results in Iran will be amazing. And if Iran's new leaders regime change are smart, Iran can have a great and prosperous future. President DJT. So there you have it in terms of where this president's mind is at, essentially responding to a lot of the criticism that he's had from Western media when it comes to NATO, EU, MAGA, his MAGA base, MAGA influencers, and pundits who essentially rallied behind this president to get him back in office for his second term have really criticized him on this war, essentially saying that he was pushed into this war by Israel, which he's saying he's not, that he's got a mind of his own. This was all his own doing and all of his own ideas, according to his statement on Truth Social, essentially as a response back to what he's hearing take place. And of course, there's been a lot of backlash is also from the countries who've been highly affected, because Strait of Hormuz, is responsible for 20% of the world's oil. So that's going to, India, 60%, Japan, 65%, 75% to Japan, South Korea, also in the 70s, China, 40%, and of course the GCC countries who haven't had the production and the output that they did prior to this war. So the impact is heavy, and we know the market reacts immediately. The market does not wait to see, what the fallout of these decisions and ceasefire and wars are. It immediately responds to tweets or what President Trump has put on Truth Social or the media when it comes to statements on the ceasefire. So that's the latest. Of course, we're going to keep you, on top of what takes place today. If Iran will show up for a second round of talks, what does this mean? Iran has said it's going to retaliate. What does that mean? Is it going to retaliate through its proxies like Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to Israel? Is it going to retaliate through what it's already done to the GCC ports? Or it's unknown how it's going to retaliate. And so yeah, this is a very high, heavily escalated situation that it looks like President Trump, I don't know how he's going to de-escalate it. And of course, we're going to see what that means for Pakistan in the middle of it. Are they going to be able to bring everybody back to talks? This is going to be something, huge for Pakistan to be able to do if they can at this point. Today's numbers when it comes to oil prices, Brent crude is right now trading at $94 to $95 per barrel, and WTI crude is at $87 to $88 per barrel. We're going to see where that stands given tomorrow of this escalation, since President Trump said, the U.S. delegation is on its way. And, that raises the question on his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and in terms of what is his role, because, we've been talking about this for a few weeks now since this war began. And before this war began, Jared Kushner was at the table. And if you know that this term, Jared Kushner is not in the White House. He doesn't have an official role in the White House. He doesn't have like a role. So there's been no Senate hearings. There's been no security clearance. There's been no checks on whether there's a financial conflict of interest, because we know Jared Kushner now, has a sovereign, has money from the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia that he's also invested. So he's been in the middle of having his close relations, obviously, to Israel's prime minister, and close relations to the president of the United States, being his son-in-law, and then what he's done in the past, I guess 4 to 5 years under the Biden era, which is essentially work very closely with the GCC countries and invest their money. And so he's here at these talks, and he was there with Steve Witkoff at the talks prior to the war starting on February 28th. And so there's a lot of questions about why is he there, and the people did not put him there. He hasn't had a confirmation from Senate. He hasn't had the security clearance. There hasn't been any checks and balances in place. And yet, he was there where President Trump said, Jared told me to, join the attacks with Israel on Iran on February 28th, even though there were talks and Oman said that they were about to reach a deal. So there is all of that in place, which history will, I guess, take a look at it and decide, what really happened here, and where were the conflicts of interest and personal conflicts of interest that led to this war that's seen right now 4,000 people dead and many, many more thousands of people injured, and what that means for this conflict that it may escalate any moment because of the occurrences of this past weekend.